Hello guys, welcome to my new tutorial. Today I'll be talking about methods in C#. I'll be talking about how you will make your first method and of course why we should be using methods. And that's something I think it's really important to know before you start using them. You should know why you're using them, of course. First off, how are we going to write down our first method? Well, as you can see on the screen here, you first have to define the method's header, and the header is defined by a few things. First off, you need to tell the method's restriction, which can be left empty. You can leave this empty and it will automatically be private. You can also write down private for cleanness sakes. You can choose it to be public, and you can choose it to be protected. And we won't be diving into the restriction part of this too much. Just use private for now until we've covered the classes in C#. That's when this becomes important. Then the next thing we should always type is the return type of this method, and the return type is the thing that the method returns to its caller. So if you write down a method to look up, in this case a username, well, a name is usually a string, so we want to set return type a string. Well, you might argue that there are numerous of cases in which methods don't return anything, and still you need to define a return type here, and that's why you can type the return type void, which says that it returns nothing. Right, and of course we shouldn't forget the name of the method. It should be like the variables, it should be straight to the point. It should tell you what the method does. In this case it's pretty clear. It gets the username in a string format, and please do use capital letters after each word, just for readability's sake. And something you can give to a method is an argument. This isn't strictly necessary. You can leave it empty, but you can also choose to give this method some variables. For instance, if we want to get a username, we want to give this method a user ID. So then in the body, in here between the brackets, we can make some code that looks up this user ID and links it to the username. Let's see how the body looks. Well, the method's body is where the action happens, so where you perform your coding, and it's all written down between those brackets here. So that's how we define a method. And let's see what the advantages of methods are. And here I've already created a Windows Forms application in which I have my form here. I have three different text boxes called TB value 1, TB value 2, TB value 3, and a button to check the values within them. And as a matter of testing, I've said that those values should not be higher than 10. And if we want to check if one of those values is higher than 10, then we need to code some logic, and that's what I've put in this button event. I made a click event here, and in this event I've created three if statements: 1, 2, 3. In each one I convert the value of the respectful text box to an int and check if it's larger than 10, and if it's larger than 10 I'll be showing a message box which says that the value is too high. And of course I'm doing this for TB value 1, TB value 2 and TB value 3. notice that this code consists of 12 lines, and you might argue that this is not very efficient, because basically you're performing the same step 3 times, you're checking the same thing 3 times, only with one variable, and that is that it's still every time it's a different text box. So we could say we could make this coding a bit more efficient to create a method which checks on a value that has been given and then returns a message box, or shows a message box, or it doesn't. So let's create that. Let's make that happen. We're gonna get out of the event into the class here, and then we're gonna make a private void check text box values. Right, then we have our private method in which we are going to write down some code to check the value, and the code is basically the same as what we have here. We can say if convert to int 32 and then the value, and if that value is larger than 10, well, then we show the message box. As you see, I haven't typed anything here and haven't typed anything here, and that's because I want to give this method an argument here, which gives it the text box that I'm trying to check. So I can give it a text box tb. Yeah, so every time I'm going to call this method, I'm going to give it a text box along with it, and then I can type tb. I can call tb here dot text, and then it's gonna get the text out of this text box, convert it to an int, and check if it's larger than 10. And then I'm gonna write down the message value of, and then I'm gonna get the name of this text box is too high. Righto. Now we can delete all these lines here. Push, gone. And then we are going to call the method we just created, and we can call it 3 times because we want to check 3 text boxes. So for the first, check text box values with the first text box, text tb value 1, values tb value 2, and check text box values tb value 3. And as you can see, our event has gone from 12 lines to 3 lines, and our method only consists of 4 lines, so that makes it 7, which decreases your code by 5. And you might argue that's not really a big deal, but I think I've mentioned it a few times in the previous tutorials that your programs will be gaining lines and lines and lines until you've reached thousands of lines, and when you apply the same coding those kinds of projects, you will potentially decrease it by hundreds of lines. So right, let's see if it works. Should be the case, of course. Let's make it 5 to 1, then we shouldn't see any text box, and we aren't. And let's make this one 11, and we're gonna get the value of tb value 2, which is the second, is too high. As a second example of a method, we could create a method that returns the sum of all three text boxes. We want to count TB value 1 plus TB value 2 plus TB value 3 and return that value to me. So we could say private int and then get total text box values or something, and then we are going to give it text box TB1, text box TB2 and text box TB3. Ta-da! Okay, and we are getting an error because Visual Studio sees that you have created a method which returns something and not void, and yet in the body we aren't returning anything. But we'll get to that point, so just never mind that error for now. First thing we need to do is we are going to create an integer, int sum, and sum is the conversion of all those values, and then counting them. Convert to ints, tb2 dot text plus convert to int 32 tb3 dot text. Right, so when we are calling this method, we're going to give it all those text boxes, then it's going to convert all those text boxes or the text in those text boxes to an int and count them up, put them in sum, and then we can return sum. Of course, when we return it, we have to put this value in a variable. So if we are calling get total text box values, TB value 1, TB value 2 and TB value 3, then well, if we don't change the code by now, it will return the sum into nothing because we aren't saving it, we aren't making sure we are doing anything with this value. So we are going to create an int here, int sum, or int result maybe is, and then the method. So this tells us that the variable result will contain the result of this method, and then we can potentially show a message box here, message box show sum of all text boxes is so after this method we're going to make a message box which says that the sum of all the text boxes is, and then the string conversion of this result. Let's see, I want to make it 5, 4, 5 and 1, so it should be 10, final result, and the sum of all text boxes is 10. Great. And the next thing I would like to talk about is the property that we can give a method an optional argument. And an optional argument means that you can give a method an argument, but you can also leave it blank. And I could demonstrate this by maybe making another text box here. Let's get those down a little bit, and we make a text box in which we can enter our name. So we give it a name, say TB name, and we can make a button pt login, and as text we give it login, and we create a button event by double clicking, and we are going straight to our event here. And we could say that we want to see a message box that says hello, welcome to this program, and maybe show my name in it somewhere. And if this text box is blank when this button is clicked, we could say that the name is guessed. And that's something we could test or demonstrate with a method. And in this method we could make it void, and we could call it login user, like this. And we want to give it the string of the text that's being put in here, right? So we can say string username. This now is an argument that is necessary to call when you are calling the method, so you have to give it a username, else it will return with an error. I can show you if I call this login user, it's gonna give us an error because no method is found that takes 0 arguments. There's only one method with 1 argument here. But we can make this argument an optional argument if we define a default value here, and that could be guessed. So string username will be guessed unless we give it something in here. We could say if tb name.text is blank, then we log in the user, and else we log in the user with his or her name. Typo. So if the text in the text box is empty, then it's gonna call this one, and otherwise it's gonna call this one. And in here we can say we are going to create a message box which shows welcome plus username like this. And if we run the program, we can leave it blank and click login, and then it says welcome guest. Or we could say my own name, Dave, and it will say welcome Dave. That's great. One last thing I would like to show you guys is the principle of overloading a method. And overloading basically means that you have multiple methods with the same name. Let me show you. We could have, well, we could do it with get total text box values. Let's say, for instance, we have a method which will get the total of 2 text boxes, and we have a method which would get us the total of 3 text boxes. We need 2 different methods then, but it should be no problem to call it a different name. But as the code gets very long, it might be just easy to give it the same name, so we just know it will do the same with a slight difference, of course. So we could say int get total text box values tb1 and text box tb2, like this, and we can copy this into that and delete the last text box. So now we have two methods with exactly the same name, exactly the same return type, and almost exactly the same code, and the only difference is the change in arguments. We have a different number of arguments, and the difference in calling is that if we are calling the method with 3 arguments, it's gonna run this one, and if we're calling the method with only 2, so if we're gonna delete the last one, now it has 2, it's gonna run this method. You can also make a method with the same name and the same number of arguments, but with different types of arguments. So for instance, I can get a total text box value with let's show you. Private int get total text box values with an int value 1 and an int value 2, and herein we can count and return value 1 plus value 2. As you see, it has the same name, they have the same number of arguments, but those arguments have a different type, and by checking which type you are giving the method on the call, in this case it's the text box, it's going to the method with 2 arguments and the method which has the type text box, so this one, and we can change it to 1, 5. Now we have 2 arguments with both integers, and then it's gonna call this one. That's basically it, guys. I hope you found this tutorial interesting, you've learned something, and I hope to see you back soon.